Dungeons and Dragons, Pathfinder, Dune, Star Trek, Star Wars, you pick the setting, but ask yourselves this. What do the Dwindwalian Empire, the Imperium of Mankind, the Holy Roman Empire, the Padishah Empire of Dune, the Galactic Empire and the Klingon Empire as well as the Roman Empire all have in common? Well, if it isn't obvious, they are all ruled by an emperor or by an empress. Now, do you need to know what an empire is when world building? Honestly, yes, I believe it helps you tremendously if you do. So I invite you to stick around, have a cup of something tasty, and I will give you a very short version of what you need to know to take your world building to the next level. Hello all you wonderfully funky people, and welcome to today's episode of Funky Monkey MP. Today's episode is on empires and how to implement them in your world building. It's been a hot second, hasn't it? Well, life got in the way, you know how it is, but today I am back with an awesome episode. While we will be talking about what an empire is, I will also be painting an awesome miniature, and I will stop from time to time and talk about how the painting is progressing. Now, let me introduce today's awesome miniature. On today's episode, I will be painting this amazing Vampire Lord miniature. As you can see, it's quite impressive, quite detailed. What can I say? It's an amazing miniature. I also want to make it abundantly clear that this paint job was a very steep learning curve for me, actually. I set out with some ideas, some goals, some plans, but halfway through the paint job I realized I didn't like the direction the painting was going. So I started changing things. What I want you to take away from this episode is that it's always okay to change your mind when it comes to painting your miniatures. Just go with what feels right. Don't be afraid to change things up as long as the end result is something you are happy with. You will see that I've added layers upon layers of paint, and this isn't honestly the best thing, but the end result was something I was really happy with. I went with the idea of an armor made out of either glass or emeralds actually, and I tried to convey the idea of light being caught and reflected. This took some doing, so I hope you learn something from my struggles. With that out of the way, I believe it's time we get started. First and foremost, we all know what an empire is and who runs it, right? I mean, all our lives we hear about empires, we learn about them in school, we hear and read about them in movies and in books, and there isn't all that much left out. The person on top holds complete and utter power. They are the law, they are the state. They run things as they please and place people they trust in key positions. The territory they control is immense and diverse, and empires are very powerful political constructions, right? I mean, there isn't much else, right? Well, yes, in broad terms, that's correct. But that's just it. There's so much more. So much you can use when world building. So let's set the scene by asking a few questions and bring world building to the next level. So, is it imperative, pun intended, for you to know everything about how an empire works in order to insert at least one in your world? No. Did Frank Herbert describe in great detail how Shaddam Corino IV ran his empire, or did Gene Roddenberry describe in great detail how the Klingon Empire was ran? No. Did either of them know how an empire was actually ran? I'm sure they did. Did they assume their audience would know how an empire was ran? I have no idea, but I'm guessing yes. Will it help you to know what an empire is in your world building endeavors? Hell yeah. Why? Because even if you don't go into great detail, and I recommend you don't, it will still help you when building political intrigue, plot twists, stories of civil wars, of heroes, schemes and plots, infiltrations and alliances. When talking about who had an emperor or empress's ear, who had access to them, and who was a threat, these are threads you can weave in your stories and have your players tug at. And with that, let's dive in. What is an empire? Well, according to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, it is a major political unit having a territory of great extent or a number of territories or peoples under a single sovereign authority. But this doesn't tell us much more than we already knew. What is important to know is that within an empire, there are in essence two different constructs: the core of the empire and the periphery. The closer you are to the seat of power, the more rights you have. The further you are, on the other hand, the fewer rights you had, and of course the more exposed you were. Close to the core, you had a stronger government and loyalty towards the seat of power, while the further from the core you were, the more divided the loyalties. And why is that? Well, it's quite simple. Being on the periphery meant that you were perhaps more recently conquered. As such, you had thoughts and objections regarding those who just conquered your homeland. And second, given the vastness of most empires, anything going on the periphery was either ignored by the seat of power, or it took a very long time to reach the core and get a response. This means that people can do some shady things before a response is expected from the core, more or less, and people have to fend for themselves, being a little bit more independent, let's say. At the same time, the closer you were to the core, the more consolidated the power was. It means that the longer you've been in the empire, the more benefits you had, access to goods, protection, even influence, and the happier you were for no longer being the periphery. Makes sense, right? How did empires come to be? Well, there is no straight answer as you might imagine, but there are two main classic methods of creating an empire, or a combination of the two. There are multiple cases where an empire came to be through war and conquest, where a state conquered other states and started assimilating the population, imposing their own beliefs, laws, culture, way of life, etc., but through military might. And there are some cases where empires emerged through alliances and collaboration between multiple nations that came together. In this case, the culture that emerges is usually a blend of the best parts of each member states. Most empires on Earth came to be through military conquest that would have had a multitude of reasons behind it. The main reasons for conquest were, of course, the desire to control resources, control certain areas, or even in order to pacify aggressive or unstable neighbors by bringing them under a central rule, thus removing the instability, or even coming together against a common foe. The nations in an empire could be held together through sheer military force, and for that we have a great example in the empire created by Alexander the Great, an empire that crumbled and divided upon his death. Or they could be held together through cultural and diplomatic means, such as in the case of the Roman Empire, where culture, laws, beliefs, goods, and even language were used to maintain cohesion. Oh, and of course in Asia, the Chinese Han Empire leaned heavily on administration and bureaucracy to hold together a very diverse collection of autonomous provinces, much like in the case of the Roman Empire. What kind of power did the emperors or empresses have? The best way to explain what kind of power the ruler of an empire wielded is by explaining the concept of imperium, the origin of the word empire. The term translates as absolute or kingly power. At its core, it derives from the Latin verb imperare, which means to command. During the Roman kingdom, the king would have imperium, absolute power. While during the Republic, this power was reined in by the Roman Senate and somewhat diluted, and this power could actually be objected to by the citizens and their representatives, the tribunes. What's very important is that in the army, this power, the imperium, remained undiluted in the hands of the imperator or the army commander who had supreme power when it came to leading the troops and dispense punishments. During the Republic, these imperators would usually be the consuls who each ruled half of the army. There were 2 consuls elected. Mind you, this power could have been overruled or vetoed by a fellow magistrate or a pro-magistrate who had the same power, meaning that if a consul went hog wild, the other consul could overrule their power, or someone with greater imperium, greater power, could do so. Or in some cases, even the tribune of the plebs could overrule a consul, but this is where we get in other territories. This is more of Roman law. We're not gonna get into that. Just as a more detailed explanation and a teaser for a future video, the dictator's imperium was greater than the consul's imperium, who had greater imperium than the praetor, and the praetor had more imperium than the edile, and so on and so forth. Sooner rather than later, we will be talking about what a dictator was or is, but you know the drill. That's another story for another time. Oh, and one more interesting aspect, the imperium was granted for a certain field and did not extend beyond that. For example, a consul had imperium over the army, but not over other things, while a magistrate could be invested with imperium over, let's say, trade or immigration. With all of that said, let's talk about the miniature for a bit before coming back to empires. As I mentioned at the start of this video, I changed my mind halfway through the paint job, and again, this is not something insanely bad. Another thing I want to advise you is try and keep your paint job modular. What I mean by this, I'm sure it has a different name, but this is what I call it. So if you start working, for example, on the cape, make sure you finish the cape before moving on to something else. Start a part of the paint job and finish it before moving on. This will help you with the overall image of the miniature, and it will help you be more focused and more intentional with your painting. Of course, you can jump around and clean up mistakes, but don't go hog wild with it. How did emperors come to power? Depending on the moment in history, this depends a lot. The general rule was that emperors, like kings, would establish a dynasty and their descendants would be hailed as new emperors upon the death of the emperor or the empress. This is usually the universal rule, but because I phrase it like that, you know, there are some exceptions from that rule. So here we go. The most standout exception from the rule of establishing a dynasty was actually the Roman Empire. The first emperors, in the basic sense of the word, were elected. They were state magistrates who had absolute power for a fixed period of time. In this case, they were the consuls. This power was granted to them for 1 year, and in order for the consuls to retain their imperium, they had to be re-elected in office. Eventually, this changed. Octavianus is recorded as being the first actual full-fledged emperor of the Roman Empire, and he was hailed as such in 27 BCE. People actually know him better as Augustus, so I'm gonna call him that. Now, because Romans did not want to return to the kingdom era and make Augustus their king, at least in name, they hailed Augustus as consul, meaning he had military imperium, and then named him consul sine collega, meaning without a colleague, thus holding supreme power over the army. The Senate eventually also granted him the title imperator, meaning commander, thus sealing the deal, making him the supreme commander of the army. At the same time, it's not like they had any choice as to not do that. The emperor was not hailed consul every year, but being called imperator, he basically retained that power, while actual consuls were elected to actually perform the required duties. So, the first Roman emperors were elected. Now, not all Roman emperors had direct descendants. Actually, many of the Roman emperors were adopted by the emperor and named as heir, or later as Caesar, but that's a different story. So, here are a few examples of emperors who were adopted. Augustus is the first one on the list, as he was adopted by Caesar. Tiberius, the second emperor, was the former son-in-law of Augustus. Claudius was the grand-nephew of Augustus and hailed by the Praetorian Guard as emperor. Trajan was adopted by Nerva and hailed by the army. Antoninus Pius was adopted by Hadrian, and so on and so forth until the collapse of the empire. What is interesting is that in the case of the Roman Empire, the tradition of hailing a commander as imperator became the de facto way of electing a new emperor. Each individual who took the throne was hailed as imperator by the army. This got to the point where in the 1st century we had the year of the 4 emperors between 68 and 69 CE. It was a year when 4 different armies hailed 4 different legion generals as imperators. And all 4 of them marched on Rome, knowing that the first one to get there was most likely to hold power. But this wasn't an isolated moment in time, as there were multiple instances when an army group hailed their general as imperator, while another army hailed their general, thus plunging the empire in civil war. If the army did not recognize the authority of the individual sitting on the throne by hailing them as imperator, those individuals' days on the throne were very, very numbered. Who had the emperor or empress's ear? When it comes to emperors and empresses, there were of course people who had a lot of sway at the court. Their spouses had a lot of influence, as you might expect, but they heavily relied on a very well set up bureaucracy and administration. They named their most trusted people in key positions across the empire and in command of armies to ensure that things went smoothly, and they surrounded themselves with advisors. Depending on the ruler's character, these advisors had more or less power to sway the emperor or empress towards a decision, as you might imagine. But no emperor or empress ever ruled without a lot of advisors and specialists. Even the most despised emperors in history had enough sense to name competent people or leave competent people in key positions, otherwise everything would have crumbled around them. Moreover, most emperors throughout history came from pretty well-off families, meaning they had an education, they had tutors, they had advisors, even from a very, very early age, while they were being prepared for a military or a political career. A good example that emphasizes this idea is actually the Roman Emperor Nero, who had a famous tutor and advisor growing up and for a few years during his reign, namely the philosopher Seneca. Empires in ancient times versus medieval and modern times. Empires throughout time did not really change that much from their first appearance, with the exception that after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, empires started establishing strong dynasties, some of them even surviving to this day. The most notable aspect of European history is that almost all empires that emerged in the medieval ages and up to contemporary era wanted to emulate the Roman Empire. Let me give you some examples. After the official fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476, Europe was plunged in a dark period of time, also known as the Dark Ages, but very brief period of time. The first empire to fill the power vacuum was the Carolingian Empire, formed in 800 CE, almost 350 years after the fall of the empire. The empire emerged from the Frankish kingdom located in modern-day France. The name France comes from the Franks. King Charlemagne went on to conquer the Italian peninsula, parts of the Iberian Peninsula, and parts of Central Europe. Emperor Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, was anointed Emperor of Rome in 800 by Pope Leon III, thus transforming his kingdom into an empire. Oh, by the way, Charlemagne's knights were the first paladins in history. I have a video on them if you are curious. I think it's right over there. The Carolingian Empire effectively collapsed in 887. In 962, we see the emergence of the Holy Roman Empire led by the Germanic King Otto I, or Otto the Great, after being anointed Emperor of Rome. He also started trying to reconstruct the Roman Empire by conquering most of the ancient Roman provinces in Western and Central Europe. This is a running theme. In more recent times, the British, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch empires realized that trying to reconstruct the Roman Empire meant going at war with one another and with the Ottoman Empire. So they used maritime power and trade to control vast parts of the world through sheer military power and monopolies. These empires became, in essence, mercantile and colonizing empires. And for the most recent of times, we have a great example of an empire that used sheer military strength and ideology to hold itself together, and that is the Soviet Empire. And with that, let's talk about the miniature for a bit before we start wrapping things up. So now I am starting to wrap up the final elements of the miniature. I'm wrapping up the armor, and then at the end I will focus on the head and on the base, but the hard part is over. As you can see, the miniature right now looks nothing like it did, I don't know, half a video ago, but I am very happy with the results. Although there are several more paint layers than I wanted, I'm not too concerned because all of the layers I applied were quite thin. I'm really happy with the armor and the glass-like effect I managed to convey. I experimented a lot with this miniature. I enjoyed it. It was quite frustrating at moments, but the end result made it all worthwhile. Again, don't be afraid to experiment, and don't be afraid to push the limits, and don't be afraid to change your mind. This is very important. Something similar you will see when I start working on the head, as there are several layers because I kind of went back and forth between some looks that I was experimenting with. I wasn't sure what I wanted for the end result, but again, keep it down to thin layers and just have fun. Now I'm working on the blade. This is a moment I kinda dropped the ball when I could have experimented more, making the sword look like glass as well. But oh well, next time. The ruler and their subjects. As I mentioned earlier, there was a clear distinction between citizens of an empire, with those on the periphery being more exposed and benefiting from less rights and protections. The exception being the colonists hailing from the core of the empire who established on the periphery, or from areas that had been conquered and colonized a while ago. The Roman Empire used to establish colonies, bringing citizens from across the empire to establish new hubs and administrative centers. These individuals had all the benefits of normal citizens and played a major role in assimilating the conquered population. They would open up businesses, they would bring goods from very far away parts of the empire, and slowly but surely they brought the way of life into the new territories. Over time, more and more of the local population wanted to live like the colonists and benefit from all those privileges, so they started emulating them. Of course, the local population usually was treated very poorly and was heavily exploited, at least at first. But contrary to common belief, Romans did not take every conquered nation into slavery, nor did they eradicate whole nations. Most slaves were captured soldiers, and they were sold into hard labor like in mines, while the civilian population was indeed enslaved, but only if they were part of cities or nations that put up a fierce fight, resistance. If the population surrendered and invited the Romans willingly and collaborated with them, the population would not be enslaved, or at least not the vast majority of it. In time, some colonies were granted a higher status and recognition by the core part of the empire, and eventually whole provinces were granted citizenship. This was a huge deal. In medieval times, we see almost the exact same thing that the Romans did in the case of the medieval European empires, the British, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch. All of them established colonies, be it in the Americas or in Asia. The conquered populations were either enslaved or, in the best case, heavily exploited, with only those who collaborated enjoying some benefits, while the colonists enjoying all the benefits they would enjoy back home, and even more because they didn't have to answer to the law as often. Empires then and now. Today, there are no more empires, at least not in the same form we would recognize from history. Most of the official empires collapsed or dissolved in the first part of the 20th century, with some shortly after the mid of the century. As we speak, there are several empires, although officially they aren't. To mind immediately come the USA, Russia, China, the Commonwealth, and even the European Union, all coming very close to what we would consider an empire. Think about it. Let's take, for example, the European Union, as it is the most telling example. It has its own administrative body, its own laws, its own currency, and even its own military. The United States of America is another great example, being a collection of previously independent states that came together to face a common threat and then remained in a cohesive unit. How to use everything we learned here today in your world building. Now that you know how empires come to be and how they function, it's not too hard to integrate them in your world. I personally created a once mighty empire that dominated almost a whole continent, but almost crumbled after a civil war that tore it asunder, leaving it less than half of what it was. My players were able to visit the splinter nations and ally themselves with their rulers, allowing them to eventually take over the empire with the help of their allies and save the world and bring forth a golden age. They saw the disparities between the core areas of the empire and the periphery, where people lived in fear and poverty and constant threats and so on. I invite you to do the same and sprinkle a mad emperor or empress here and there just for a little bit of spice. Or add a ruler without an heir, or one that was named by the army and is now under the thumb of some tyrannical generals that don't allow the young emperor or empress to rule how they see fit and bring forth an age of prosperity. Play around with these concepts and see what you get, as I am sure there is no chance you won't end up with an amazing story that both you, your players, or your readers, or anybody interacting with your world won't love. Mango's fifth name is Of the Gentle. And with that, if you enjoyed this video and found value in it, please make sure you like, as it shows me it was useful. Subscribe and join this growing, wonderful, funky community, and hit the bell so you are notified when the next video is out. And if you want to go the extra mile, just share it with your friends, your DMs, GMs, storytellers, creators, players, neighbors, family, friends, pets, everybody. Thank you so much for the privilege of your time. I truly hope you found some inspiration and learned something new today, and I can't wait to see you all funky people here next time on Funky Monkey MP, the place where you get your dose of miniature painting, history, world building, and even some trivia. Remember, be curious, take inspiration from the past, and never ever stop learning, world building, and creating amazing things, whatever those are. Your mind and imagination are awesome, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Until next time, have yourselves a wonderful, wonderful, funky day. Cheers.